So good morning again, everyone. Glad to have you at our today's webinar on the IDSA Rulebook, an overview and how to implement it. My name is Sebastian Steinbus, CTO of International Data Spaces Association. I will not present the rulebook today. I have my dear colleague Marko Turpeinen with me, who will present the rulebook to you later on. I'm really glad that we restart the Tech Talk series in 2023 to guide all of you through all the great achievements, documents, and assets that we have in IDSA that our community generates and creates and builds. So our webinar today is again powered by some research project that IDSA is active in and that support the creation of the rulebook and of this webinar on all the other assets that we have in IDSA. So today here the BD4 Energy project, Databricks, Datamite, EnerShare, Omega X, and the Tango project to be mentioned here explicitly. So after that one, I'm a little bit lost. So let's get back to our webinar. As mentioned today we have the topic of the IDSA Rulebook, an important asset that we started working on a couple of years ago with a version 1 that was pretty good and helped us a lot to explain how to build data spaces from the different perspectives that we have. Not only the technical perspective that we cover in the reference architecture model, but going beyond that one, the business, legal, operational, functional, and technical perspective, basically. So that's the idea. And during this webinar, we will give you a sneak preview to the new version of the IDSA Rulebook version 2. This time it is really a version 2. So we have a lot of great new content. We are on the last mile to make it a public beta, so we will make it available via the IDSA homepage for review during the next week. So after you've heard the presentation of today and asked your questions, you can start reading and digging into the details in the next week from here. Having said that, I would like to hand over to our presenter today, Marko Turpeinen, CEO of 1001 Lakes, chair of our working group Rulebook, and also full professor at Aalto University. I think he's really the best candidate to present the IDSA Rulebook, seeing his background in his professional and scientific career, also the background with the Zitra Rulebook, where Marko was also part in the creation. So I think we couldn't have any better presenter today to guide us through the rulebook. So Marko, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Sebastian, for this very, very kind introduction, and I'm very pleased and honored to be here today to give you this tech talk on the work that we've done together on the new version of the rulebook primarily. My background is, as said, mixed. So I'm both an academic in the Aalto University context in the computer science department, but we have this company, so I thought I would start very, very briefly just saying, the context where I'm coming from. So 1001 Lakes is a company based in Finland. We are 4 years old, and we want to be experts in the theme of data spaces, collaborative data ecosystems, helping enabling these ecosystems to be developed and to flourish. And particularly, we have taken this approach of rulebooks as a special kind of focus and expertise that we have. We have very much been active in this another set of collaborative work, which I will refer back to later in my presentation, which has happened primarily here in Finland around the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra and the rulebook for fair data economy work there. But all the way, we have also been quite active in these international settings, and IDSA member from pretty much from the beginning, and see the enormous value that these collective cooperative activities that we now have around data spaces can bring. So very, very happy to contribute to our common good. Now, moving to the topic of today. So what do we mean by IDSA Rulebook? Let's start from there. As already mentioned by Sebastian, so we do have one already. So 1.0 was written and published in 2020, and it's a solid document. On the other hand, things have changed somewhat after that time, so there was a need for a revision, and also the role of this first version was very much also looking more towards, like, internally towards IDSA, and how does IDSA function as an organization and what is its role as an organization. But I think we thought that there is a need to be more, expanding and looking outwards, and what will IDSA and IDS as a standard, or as a foundation to build data spaces, what will it bring to the members, and how the members should actually then take IDSA in their use, and then what kind of common practices and settings we can have around that. So that's sort of the setup with which we started then the new phase, the 2.0 phase of this work. But still, kind of, to summarize, so the rulebook is all about, first of all, kind of defining what do we mean by data spaces, what are the functional requirements, what do you need to have, what is mandatory, so that you can say that this is a data space. Then it also helps in several ways to understand the different dimensions of technical, operational, and legal, and also kind of shows the setting, the framework, the agreements that we commonly need to have to run data spaces, and make the IDS ecosystems actually work. And aligned with that is sort of the understanding that this is a governance exercise. So mostly when we talk about IDSA, so it's really strong in the technical skills, the architecture, reference architecture is very, very, strong document from that side, that we show technically how data spaces should be built, what is the right kind of architecture. But the rule book, expands this towards, well, but how do we then govern these? How do we set them up? How do we, operate the data spaces? And then this rulebook helps in having that common understanding, this common framework for governance. And it's supposed to be very, broadly applicable. It's industry agnostic, and should be applicable to all verticals across different domains. So hopefully broadly adaptable. So in more detail, so the functional requirements include, let's say, the different roles of the participants, what is mandatory, what is optional in data spaces, and how do you actually implement these functions that create data sovereignty for the members? How is that done in practice? Then and what's required in the data spaces to make that data sovereignty possible. So that's the first part. The second part, or second, area is the technical agreements. And here, I think what we've done is quite straightforward. So we've just referenced what is already out there. So this will not be a place where we repeat what the reference architecture model is saying, or what are the resources available in the open source repositories of IDSA, or how does the certification work. But we refer to them and show how they work from the kind of a common understanding of processes and in that sense rules for IDSA members. Then there is this category of operational agreements, and I think that's really actually one of the areas where in 2.0 we've spent quite a lot of time and trying to build this side of the rulebook. And here I would say that it also have a little bit of this component of being a cookbook. So it's not only about, okay, so this is what you should have, and this is mandatory if you run your data space instances. It's more about, okay, let us also help you to find best means and best ways to get your data space running and operating. And in that sense, kind of, it's not so much a recipe book, so that it would have, do this, and this, and this, and then you have your data space up and running. It's more that kind of a cookbook that I like, which is about kind of the practices and the best ways of cooking, not so much the individual recipes. But that's sort of very much on the operational side. And then connected to that is the legal agreements and legal dimension. How do we fit in the broader regulatory framework which is evolving, and what kinds of guidance and perhaps even contractual templates we have that we can propose for different IDS implementations. So this is sort of a map of also today's talk. So I will go through these different bits and pieces in much more detail. And underlying there is this idea from IDSA point of view that we want to be good in all of these different phases. Well, at the base, there is this IDS reference architecture model. So it's going to be, it is the core, it's the design for all data spaces. And then you have these more kind of detailed specifications for different components that are and some reference implementations as well. And for this, we need a life cycle. There needs to be kind of a process that IDSA is running, and that's partially at least described here in the rulebook as well. How do we guarantee that all of this base on which you all build your data spaces is actually there, and you can rely that it will be there. So that in that way, this sort of life cycle of what's coming out of IDSA and how it can be used by different parties is really important. Certification, really important part of the whole setup, and then let's make the actual data space instances run, and how do you use these underlying building blocks in practice. That's the operations phase. So all of these dimensions are kind of relevant for IDSA rulebook. And in this picture, which is often used by IDSA, showing that there is the RAM, there is IDSG, which is the portfolio of building blocks, and then there is the certification scheme, and they sort of make this triangle of trust that IDSA is providing. So then in addition, there is kind of this fourth element in the triangle, or that kind of adds on, which is this rule book, which is very much about, okay, how do you actually then implement all of this that IDS provides, and what kinds of things you need to take into account when you bring your data spaces to life. As Sebastian said, so fairly recently, well, about a year ago, so we set up a specific working group in IDSA for this topic, so rulebook working group, and we want to make sure that that is aligned with other IDSA processes, and I think that has worked, quite well, and it is open like any other working group for all IDSA members. We have had good participation so far, but all members definitely welcome. Every month, the first Tuesday from 12:30 to 2 in the afternoon. So we have our monthly meeting. So please join us, join the group, join the community if you feel that this is something you want to contribute to. We actually have 3 co-chairs. So myself, then Peter Kohn from Microsoft, and Olaf Gergamain from Orbiter. So 3 chairs, and of course, for example, Sebastian has been very active in the group. Now, well, I think what is the rulebook I already mentioned. So let's skip that. 2.0 is the new thing. So we've been working on this quite actively for, I would say, already like half a year, and now we are ready to come out with the beta version. And now we've made this conscious decision that there are still fairly many new things in the rulebook that are not tested with the broader community, and where we really want to have your feedback. And I will go through many of those during my presentation today, but all in all, so the reason why beta now is because we want to keep this still as kind of, it's not a finalized process, even this 2.0. Well, it will not be a finalized process after that either. So of course we will make a 2.0 version that we kind of, freeze, but then this whole process of creating new versions of rule books after that IDSA Rulebook 3.0 and whatnot. So that will continue. But for this 2.0, so this is the time frame. So we have the beta out next week, and then, well, we haven't really kind of put a deadline on when we will freeze, and this is 2.0, but most likely, you know, at least the month of March, everybody can comment and participate in the process. Also beyond the working group, so you don't need to be a member of the working group to contribute. So it's going to be in the GitHub that IDSA is running. So for the work that we've done for 2.0, so here are some very broad guiding principles that we had for our rulebook work. So don't reinvent the wheel, integrate as much as possible into what's already out there as far as systems, but also as far as standards. So kind of be knowledgeable and also be ready to integrate if there are good things that are happening, let's say, outside of IDSA as well, and bring in the best. Be industry agnostic, but be also applicable kind of as a horizontal standard to all verticals, and be easily approachable, usable by individual companies. And again, the rulebook, who should read the rulebook? So I think there are different parts, different views. If you are a technical expert, there is something that you can take away from this. This is tech talk, so you know, there are definitely more like technical details in there. But also, if you are, for example, more kind of, let's say, a business responsible for your data space activity. So there are several things that help in understanding how do I manage my ecosystem, how do I get the common agreement around the things that we are doing. And then if you are a legal expert, for example, so having a look into, well, what kind of contractual templates did they come up with is another viewpoint. So kind of depending a little bit on your background and where you're coming from, I think there's something for different audiences. But overall, I guess this is the overall goal of IDSA, but kind of, you know, chipping into this bigger goal of creating an open global standard that supports data sovereignty. Also, we wanted to place the IDSA rulebook in a little bit broader context. This was not in the first version 1.0, but we start with this sort of contextualizing using this PESTLE analysis method. So there is sort of political, economic, social, technical, legal, and ethical viewpoints, and we have a kind of short link to all of these that, you know, how does IDSA, IDS, and this rulebook fit in, let's say, the current discussion on EU digital strategy, for example, or what kind of ethical issues are being considered when data spaces are being built. So, and this is quite short, and again, additional views, inputs very much invited and welcome. And then this is, we have to say that this is very much starting from the European basis. IDSA members are, there is a majority of members from Europe. And then I think that's reflected in some of the ways how we contextualize this. And this is also kind of also reflected when we show the regulatory framework later on in the legal part. But this is something also that we would like to kind of fix. So it's not the idea that IDSA is purely European initiative, and we would like to be much more kind of, you know, all-encompassing across different continents. And how do we do this? How do we kind of show that we are also able to kind of, you know, match the different environments in which IDSA is being taken into use is relevant. But I guess this is there to kind of allow the rulebook users to reflect on the values that are behind their activities. So sort of opening eyes on how IDSA does link to these broader questions of data sharing and access. And then of course there are these other major initiatives. There are many others as well, but explicitly we mentioned Data Spaces Business Alliance and Data Spaces Support Center, and how this rulebook is connected to those and wants to also influence in a way these other initiatives. So having said that and giving that as a kind of a background on what is the rulebook and how we saw when we started 2.0, so I would here like to use a little bit of time also, maybe this is slightly theoretical, but also kind of, well, when we talk about data space governance, so what kinds of dimensions are there? What do you need to consider? How do you build that framework that we are talking about? And firstly here, probably a familiar picture to many who have been following data space developments. So this is from the Design Principles for Data Spaces document from 2021 from the OpenDEI project, which had these 3 layers of soft infrastructure, ecosystem at the bottom, then ecosystem at the top, and then this sort of a synthesizing layer in the middle. And what I've done here is kind of move a little bit further and kind of try to explain, well, how does this map to the different needs for the governance of data spaces? So at the bottom, when we talk about these sort of very generic building blocks, be them interoperability building blocks, trust, value, data value, governance building blocks. So there is a need to kind of come up with common understanding and governance mechanisms on how do we build these. And IDSA reference architecture model is definitely one of those. And there, you know, GaiaX is doing similar things and so forth. But there are these sort of common building blocks that are supposed to be usable for all data by all data spaces, and how do we govern those? Then on top of that, or kind of related to that, I would say that there is this layer of more domain-specific soft infrastructure, and that needs to be governed as well. So, for example, if you have a health data space, you have certain regulation and certain metadata standards and certain open data resources and so forth that health domain uses. And it's different from agriculture. Agriculture will use there's specific regulation and requirements and metadata and whatnot for that domain. And the same story repeats in all different domains. So how do we take into account the domain specificity is really important, and how is that governed and how that linked from those kind of more generic building blocks and then these more specific sets of, for example, you know, semantic metadata descriptions is sort of combined, is something that needs to be taken into account and governed. Then on top of that, there are these ecosystems that are actually, you know, sharing the data, and they may be also cross-domain. Typically they are within domains, but they also can be cross-domains. And there might be kind of several consortia that kind of make then a larger ecosystem where they define rules for, you know, like inter-data space activities. So across these data spaces. So we have agreed that this is the way how we can use each other's data under these and these conditions, or this is how we map between, for example, those metadata descriptions. But nevertheless, so there's kind of this layer of the actual data space networks, these instances, and they form the data space ecosystems. And then for each one of those, you have a need for governance, and that's what we here call data space instance governance, and also this sort of term dedicated data space authority. I will come back to data space authority several times later during this, but the point being that that for each data space, for each ecosystem, there is a need to have some kind of a way to govern that ecosystem. Who are members, who are not members, how do you become a member, what's expected of members of my data space, of our data space. So then that's that thing at the top. And how this then maps to the let's say the IDS blocks and what IDS is doing. So at the bottom, so there are these essential services. So you really need to have these and these functions, and IDSA and IDS as architecture, for example, defines that these are the functions and this is what you need to have up and running. Then there might be some other services which IDS reference architecture, for example, can specify, but they are not essential. They might be more optional, and again, the expectation is that also when you go further up in this stack, so you have more providers, more different options, more different kind of setups that should be compatible with each other, or they might be more kind of data space specific, that in this data space we have all agreed that we will use, for example, this kind of a connector, and that means that then but then there might be also this sort of bundle that another provider provides a different set of components, but they are still compatible within that data space. So there's sort of this market of opportunity of technical solutions and components that can be then used to implement the things that are the base services and essential services. And then the different verticals have their rules, have their industry groupings, have their kind of the end users that are actually taking these IDS building blocks into use. So that's a little bit the same picture that I had earlier, but more from IDS point of view. And then lastly, so here is another layer picture, and this is from the new European interoperability framework, which was recently published. So there is here the understanding is that we need to look at the interoperability from various different viewpoints. So at the top, so there's the legal side, and if, for example, if the organizations are from different legal jurisdictions and have maybe incompatibilities between the regulations in the various countries. So how do we negotiate that? How do we still make possible the use of data across different setups when there are differences on the regulatory side? So that's one starting point for finding ways to be interoperable and having this common ground for governance. Then there are kind of the organizational level things. So the parties, the stakeholders should align, have a common view, have common goals, expectations, business processes, responsibilities, whose business model, how do we ideally create win-wins between the parties, and then how do you agree on fair rules for at the organizational level across organizations, and make those rules interoperable and scalable when new parties come in and so forth. So that's the next question for interoperability. And then you have the semantic level. So the format and the meaning, the vocabularies, the metadata standards that we use, how do we agree on those and make sure that there is interoperability across the descriptions? And then at the bottom, this sort of technical level interoperability, common building blocks, common tools based on which the data space is built. And here, in addition, you have two different viewpoints. So you have this intra-data space interoperability viewpoint, meaning that within a data space, there might be these questions of interoperability. So for example, if there are two parties from different legislations, so within the same data space, so as said, how do you negotiate? How do you kind of, make the data space work even with these differences? And then the other and more complex thing is this inter-data space interoperability. So when different data spaces need to agree on their mode of operation and their semantics and so forth. So that's another level of let's say complexity. But so this is sort of a framework when we talk about different kinds of interoperability, and it's crucial for kind of having this understanding on how do we govern these data spaces. And then lastly, so there is this view that when we build these implementations, when we kind of apply these architectures, when we actually create and run these data spaces, so it's a collaborative development exercise. So we kind of have these different feeds from the the reference implementations that actually take some architecture into use, give feedback to the working groups, and then IDSA creates a better reference architecture. And then the new version is evaluated through new reference implementations. And the similar story, the reference implementations are used by different projects that actually implement these data spaces. And again, you get feedback from the community who are developing the different components for real, and kind of having the feedback loop there. And then more and more we also see kind of the commercial offerings around data spaces, and then the different offerings are tested against the market needs and what works and what doesn't from the commercial point of view. And again, there you see kind of these feedback loops back to all the way to the reference architecture. So the idea here is that by kind of having these different aspects connected, so you can have a really kind of strong collaborative exercise. Anyway, so this was sort of my theoretical background, sort of. Let's move now to the different parts. So functional requirements, and this is actually an area where we worked quite a bit. There is a lot of text, so yeah, a heads up that there's plenty of new stuff also here. So first of all, so we made this exercise on, well, what do we then call mandatory? What's mandatory and what's optional? And this is our current best understanding. So the darker blue ones are mandatory and the lighter blue ones are optional. So you need to have the infrastructure to have data sharing and usage in place. Well, that's kind of obvious, but also it's equally obvious that you need to have the building blocks to establish trust. Then there are vocabularies and semantic models where some need to be there, and I will get back a little bit later on what. But then there's also, you know, there might be optional semantics, that's fine, but some common vocabularies will, anyway be needed. Observability of different activities, kind of transparency and ability to monitor is really important across different parties. For example, if we have, you know, agreed on data usage control, so how do we observe that those data usage control rules are being adhered to? So that's one kind of, you know, fairly fundamental function that is needed. Data discoverability, different kinds of ways to build catalogs. Some catalog will be needed anyway. How it's implemented, is it going to be a centralized or kind of distributed or decentralized? We will have, you know, they are different options, but the function of having a data catalog is necessary. It's mandatory. And then some mechanism to also facilitate this data contract negotiation. So that's another one where the usage policies actually also fit in. So having a way to agree on usage policies for data is a mandatory requirement for data spaces. And then there are others which are less, perhaps, that are not that key, that are not essential, but, you know, typically we have them. So kind of data marketplaces, app stores, different trustee and escrow services, and so forth. So there's a whole list, and then of course, if you have been following the reference architecture model, so clearinghouses, the like data brokers, lots of different roles that can be there, but optional, not mandatory. So this is a mapping of the functionalities that we had. Then I will do a bit of a deep dive in two different of those. So first one is this establishing trust, and here the idea is that in data spaces, so what we need is actually a way to describe what the data spaces are, and then for the participants of the data space also describe who they are and how they fit with the rules and kind of setup of the data space. So here the two terms, data space self-description, so data space defines what it is the DSSD, and then the participants self-description is a way for the, you know, candidate or current participants of the data space to describe who they are and how they fit within the framework of the data space. And here is a new addition, which also, as such as this term, I don't think has been widely used yet, but this is our recommendation anyway, that when we have a data space, we also need some way to implement a data space authority that, for example, can do this checking, okay, and creation of these data space self-descriptions, and then this checking of does a participant match and then, you know, is this allowed that this member is joining this network? So and who are the members of the network, for example? So that's something that the data space authority would do. So and again, for example, for things like identities, so it's really important that we have trust anchors, we have trust frameworks. There might be several of those that apply in a particular data space, but the data space authority would have the role of establishing these policies and rules, the kind of the DSSD, which is there, and then issuing credentials for memberships, and then regulating the life cycle of membership. So, you know, who are the participants? Having a list, for example, that these are the current members is a fairly self-explanatory function for data space authority. And there might be some other services that these DSAs can provide, like, you know, observability, auditing, brokering, and so forth, you know, additional vocabularies. There might be other roles, but the key roles are the three that we have there listed. So once more, these self-descriptions, so there is a participant self-description, which is on the right-hand side, and then for each data space, so there are these data space self-descriptions, and then there's kind of this matchmaking or checking whether the participants fit the data spaces. And so that's what this picture is trying to convey. And in more detail, kind of as a scheme of how this then works between different parties. So again, starting from the right, so you have participants that have their self-descriptions, and then participants can become members of a data space, and data space is trusting some kind of a trust anchor to provide identities for different parties. And then data space authority issues this credential that yes, you are a member. And then for a data space on the left-hand side, so data space has this self-description, but also it has these rules and policies, and the data space authority can be the one that enforces these rules and policies. For example, doing these auditing and checking whether things are actually being adhered to that are in our rules and policies. And then, well, the thing at the top is what I already mentioned, the data space participant registry. So this is kind of a scheme of how these different bits and pieces would work. So that's one thing. That's sort of the trust side that we included. The other thing is usage policies and also kind of vocabularies around that, and or different policies. Sorry. So when we look at these levels, so at the level of data space, so there are policies for membership. So who are the members who can become a member? What are criteria for membership? What are the rules to become a member, and so forth. Then at the level of data catalog, there are access policies on what data can be accessed and under which conditions. Then at the level of a particular data, so there are sort of, first of all, so there can be contracts per data set, for example, that now we have for these data sets agreed that this data set can be used under these conditions by this, you know, data consumer. Data provider provides data for a data consumer. So that's captured in the data contract, which then inside has these data asset policies, and there can be many. So, okay, I allow the use of this data for the next 30 days, for example, after which it needs to be deleted. So those kinds are those are the things that, you know, are in usage policies. So this is sort of an onion picture of different kinds of policies that there are in the data space. And now a key function again in a data space is how do you define these? Vocabularies are then needed, semantic models on how do you define the policies, including these membership rules. The domain-specific vocabularies can also be included there, so that, you know, when this is a health data space, so then we have these and these ways to define our policies, which are not the same, for example, in manufacturing. Access policies, data contract specific vocabularies. So the left-hand side is more on kind of how do you define the policies and what are the kind of what's the definition mechanism, what is the vocabulary, what is the language to do that. And then on the right-hand side, there are these rules and policies for actual use of the data assets. And again, that's another set of need for semantic model and vocabulary. So how do you describe the different metadata and other descriptive parts of the data assets and so forth. So that's on the right hand side. And so these are linked to the different data assets, and they should be adhered and understood by the different participants. And again, where do these come from? Well, they come from the parties that, you know, create the ecosystem, but there might be other, you know, sources. Maybe the industry as such has already endorsed these and these ways of doing this. So if we are the automotive industry, so we agree that every data space needs to have these and these kinds of ways to define policies and so forth. So there can be several ways how these are created, but the point is that you need shared vocabularies and semantic models for both describing the policies and describing what can be done with the data assets. Then I need to hurry up a little bit, but another aspect is that when we have these data space authorities, how do we build them? And this also applies to, in general, to data space architecture. So there are different options. So we might have very much centralized ways of building data spaces and also data space authorities. And on the other hand, you on the right hand side, so you can have very decentralized ways. So there is no central point. And then in the middle, there's kind of this hybrid form where you have multiple different consortia, multiple different, let's say, subgroups that then federate across themselves. And that's the way how you maybe have a little bit more scalability and robustness in the system by not having just a single centralized entity that is the data space authority. But anyway, so point here is that there are different architectures that you can use to build your data space and also to have your data space authorities. And then from the point of view of different pros and cons of these. So sovereignty here means which is of course key. So how much the different parties can control their data, how resilient these different architectures are, means that yeah, if there's something, you know, unexpected that happens, so will the data space collapse? How scalable they are in terms of number of users. What's the level of control? So here it means that that if there is the data space authority that has some control on the operation, so in these different architectures, so how much of control does the data space authority have? And then simplicity. So how easy in a way it is to get this thing going, and also operating. And discoverability. So if one goal in these data spaces and the functions of data space authority is to make it transparent and easy to understand and discover what the data space is doing, so then different architectures have their pros and cons. So the purple one here is centralized, blue is the in-between hybrid, and then decentralized has its strengths in let's say resilience and sovereignty. So that's one analysis, but also a question that we would like to throw to the community: that do you agree, and is this something that you subscribe to? Let's move forward. So so that was about the functional requirements. Then the technical agreement, I will go through this very quickly because this is basically it's nothing new. We already have these. These are the fundamental building blocks of IDSA. There's the reference architecture model that looks at the question, perhaps from the rulebook point of view, it does touch the business layer, the functional side of things, the processes, the information layer, and the system layer. There are aspects in the reference architecture model for all of these, but yeah, it's a separate process, it's a separate document, it's a foundational building block of IDSA, and we of course endorse that as yes, this is what the rule book says you need to adhere to. And similarly, there is the IDSG for IDS specifications, primarily the open source, the open source implementations of different components, for example, different communications about these different components, the information model, and the usage control mechanisms are all covered in IDSG. If you haven't looked at that, please do. But again, I mean, we don't need to reinvent in the rulebook that this is how we create these components and share them, because they are already there in IDSG and the GitHub. And similarly, the IDS certification, which is a established ongoing process. There are ways to how do we create this IDS certification by having a scheme that's understood by all of the different parties. What are the rules for that? How do you become an evaluator that you can say that yes, this is an IDS certified solution, and also how do you execute these evaluations? So these are all specified in the IDS certification working group and documents related to that. So it doesn't need to be redone here in the rule book. And again, I mean, there's the component certification side, which is this picture. And again, I don't go to the details, but yeah, there are different levels at which you can be certified from the point of view of trust and assurance. And then there's this more overall operational environment certification, which doesn't look at individual components, but looks at your entire setup of data space and verifies whether you adhere to the IDSA way of working. And then we have the test bed where you can try these things out, and also is of course connected to the certification process. So this is a tool, this is an environment in which some of these evaluations are being done, but even like beyond that, so things that you would like to try and you are building and you want to check yourself whether you are compatible with IDS or not, so you can use these testbed facilities for that. Anyway, so those are kind of the technical functions and well-established, well-running part of the IDSA machinery. Related to that, and I have these now on the operational side. So for all of these, so there is kind of a life cycle. There is a process. There is a way in which these are being updated. There are working groups. There are different checks, and then different time scales in which these are being updated and so forth. And this is a current snapshot of the different parts in the IDSA, let's say artifacts, categories, or catalog, and so these are being it's part of the rules that these are being updated, and IDSA promises to be and stand behind this, that this is an ongoing process, and you can trust that they are there. So key processes are in place, and it's important to like make sure for the parties who are building the solutions and building their data space instances that IDSA is there to support. Then I think I already mentioned this, that there is the intra and inter data space interoperability, and from the operational agreements and operational processes. So this is crucial. I have to say that in the current beta version, so there still is quite a lot of room for additions and debate, especially on the latter one. So inter data space interoperability. So when different data spaces need to be compatible and have rules that work across different data spaces, so how do we make that? So it's highly desirable, but it's quite complex to implement. On the other hand, common governance frameworks are really helpful, and then if we can have sort of common ways, common models to define these rules, so then that can be let's say a shortcut or a way to implement this sort of across data space interoperability. Here I will mention work that we've done primarily now in Finland, but is rapidly expanding across the different data spaces, and also in this context has been taken into use. So on the operational and legal side, so one model that can be used is this fair data economy model by Sitra, Finnish Innovation Fund. And it describes these data spaces from various different viewpoints. You have tools to check whether you are in agreement from the business point of view. You have ethical maturity model. You can check against different criteria, different ethical issues that may or may not apply to your data space. You have the common technical basis, well, in the context of IDSA, so it's quite clear, so it's IDS. But there might be also other things that the parties agree on technology, on security. But then one thing that this does is also it provides a legal framework, contractual framework for the different parties to set up their data space, to have a governance structure for the data space actually as legal contracts, and then also specify the data set terms of use. So this is an open set of documents published by Sitra, available, usable by anybody, and meant to be used by across all different data spaces. So it doesn't really take any stance as a model on what domain, what kind of data space, what size of a data space. So it should be usable for all data sharing networks. So briefly then, the legal dimension. So we have the regulatory framework that's in the background, and in EU alone there is plenty that's happening on the regulatory front. New kinds of regulations coming up. Well, at IDSA and from the rulebook point of view here, the thing that we can say is that we definitely follow. We probably also try to influence these developments, be them in EU, but also maybe broader across the globe, that have to do with data and data spaces, data sharing, data access. And this is also something where the legal framework task force is having a strong role. So there's a specific task force also established by the IDSA, which is looking at the legal framework and the legal dimension in a broader setting. So experts from the legal side, please join that one. On the legal agreements thing, so now, well, I mean, it could have been possible that we, as an exercise here, as part of the rule book, so we would have created a new set of contractual agreements or contractual framework that IDSA would bring in, but the conclusion was that the Sitra rulebook seems to provide a fairly good basis. So the contractual framework that is under the Sitra rulebook is actually now what we present or suggest from the legal side as, okay, why don't you look at these templates and try to fit them into your context of running a data space instance. So, and there might be additional components that are not covered by the Sitra templates for sure, and this is an ongoing work, but just to say that, we have now kind of endorsed or linked to the Sitra contractual framework as part of the IDSA rulebook. I will skip this example in the interest of time. It was just from the Finnish side, a traffic data economy network that used the rulebook model, and this is actually the table of contents of the rulebook. So to summarize, so the main takeaways from today, I guess, so the structural approach is really needed to access and share data while maintaining data sovereignty. And then so we have looked at the functional requirements from the point of view of creation of a data space and data space authority, which is kind of a new suggestion, and then requirements and obligations from the participants. So both sides we have analyzed in the functional requirements part, and then there's been an analysis on the current situation as far as the operation and the legal framework goes, but this is an ongoing and continuous debate, and you are very much welcome to join this debate. But common governance frameworks most likely will be helpful, will be needed, and for example, when we talk about inter-data space interoperability, so will be sought after. And one thing to add is that IDSA and its partners are heavily supported by Data Spaces Support Center. And one of the things that we want to do is also make sure that the work that we are doing in the rulebook is also kind of usable and fits into the framework that Data Spaces Support Center is working under. So that was that. And finally, kind of call for action. So become engaged. Now we are publishing the beta next week. Take a look at it, give us feedback. As said, at least the March time frame. And finally, kind of especially what we think that might require more input and feedback. So these various trust mechanisms that we are describing, architecture variants, their pros and cons, the legal dimension, the contracts, and then this interdata space interoperability, as I mentioned many times, and finally cross-continent coverage and compatibility, which I think still is a relative weakness of the rulebook. So we are a little bit too Europe-centric, so how can we make it less so? Would be great. Thank you, and also I want to thank on behalf of all of the other co-chairs of the working group. That's my presentation. I used almost all of the time, sorry for that, but back to you, Sebastian.
Hey, Marko, thank you so much for this exhaustive presentation. Yeah, well, it's a great rulebook that all of us have created here together. Yeah, so let me check. I think we don't have too many questions on the chat. Of course, we will follow up on the content, so slides and presentations will be available afterwards. So, as said, you basically used most of the time of our session. What is good from my perspective to give everyone a walkthrough through the whole document? I would have one point. So you briefly mentioned this, that the rulebook is, of course, basically made by Europeans at the moment when I take a look at the working group and the participation in our working group. But it's not limited to Europe. I think it's applicable really in an international context, as the name IDSA International Data Spaces also states. Would you agree on that?
Well, I think the current situation is that so far the contributions, as I said, have been coming maybe too much from the European side, but as IDSA is a global organization and wants to kind of have and cover all continents and be able to also fit a certain base of values to the situation that's happening across the globe. So I think it's important to have the different views, so we very much would invite views from Asia, from US, from South America, from Africa, whomever are looking at this. So does this fit into our context? Are there regulatory developments, for example, which might make that and that approach not applicable? This is not the culture here. We will never do it like that. I mean, again, we would very, very much like to hear this kind of feedback.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. And maybe final question from my side. Also, you mentioned this different setups of data space authorities. So obviously, it's complex to build a data space. Is there any kind of guidance that the rulebook gives or that you could give to the audience if you want to start building a data space with your community, with your partners, with whatever? What are the first questions you should ask yourself to get started, or what are the most important resources to read or to visit before getting started?
Well, I think all in all, it's really important to be aware of the different fundamental, let's say, documents of IDSA, like the reference architecture. The CITRA rulebook model that I mentioned is a nice way then to come from the other side of, okay, so we have our data sharing community, we have our network, we have our use cases maybe defined, and how do we look at this from the point of view of having everybody's interest involved and responsibilities covered, and so that's another document that I can recommend to help in defining the rules for your network.
Marko, thank you so much for walking us through the document. I think we should close this webinar. Of course, the recording will be available, so if you watch it now on YouTube and you like it, give us a thumb up. If you have any questions or comments, just get back to us. Marko mentioned it. We have our rulebook working group with the chairs that are super helpful. We will have an open consultation, so you can send us your feedback, your comments to the rule book. So let's stay tuned with that one. Marko, again, thank you so much. Everyone else, we will continue our tech talks. There will be upcoming topics during the next weeks and months. Visit our homepage where you can find more information about that. And then, again, thank you so much, Marko, and let's close for today. Thank you so much for listening. Take care.